What if the war for American independence never found its turn? Tonight we open a chronicle, not a fantasy, a ledger of winters and wages, ships and shortages, bargains struck for bread long before they're struck for glory. We begin with the sound you already know, the thud of a tax stamped in red, and we end on a night when the ocean itself seems to hold its breath. I'll keep asking you questions because a chronicle is not only what happened, it's what you, listening now, would have done if the price of an idea rose faster than the price of flour. The 1970s. Small fires suddenly everywhere. Lexington and Concord smoke. Boston sits under siege. And men in coarse, homespun, crowd roads that lead to names their grandchildren will memorize. The colonies are rich in goods and poor in coin. Specie clinks rarely in a shopkeeper's till. Debts get paid with paper and promises. Farmers who once counted grain by the bushel learn to count soldiers by the mouth. Sailors count idle days a sloop is trapped in harbor. Printers count sheets they can't afford to waste. Here our line bends. In 1777, General Howe does not march on Philadelphia. He goes north to meet Burgoyne. On a map, it's a modest red arrow curving like a reed and pointing toward Albany. In life, it's a hinge. The Hudson opens like a lock. Burgoyne is not stranded among swamps and misjudgments. He finds redcoats coming to meet him, wagons that don't run empty, scouts who don't lie. The battle that would have made Paris bold never happens. And an empire that was counting wounds counts instead the savings of a war not yet global. Without a Saratoga trumpet, France waits. No treaty in 1778 means no formal alliance. No French fleet snapping masts into rebel harbors. No sudden gold to turn congressional signatures into silver again. Continental paper decays faster than it can be printed. Nights in taverns, men slap notes on tables and ask if their ale can be poured on hope. Privateers that once slid out to gnaw at convoys find the escort thicker and crisper. A convoy alone is nothing multiplied. It's a wall. Let me ask you straight. If your purse held notes losing value by the month, how loudly would you argue for anything but peace? The 1780s. A new vocabulary creeps in early. Dominion. London blends amnesty with arithmetic. Tariff relief if ports reopen. A promise that colonial assemblies will keep more teeth. Hints about self-taxation under a familiar flag. In Philadelphia, debates shrink to a night whisper. Some leaders will die before signing a compromise. Others measure policy by the price of candles and the squint of their children at the hearth. Veterans come home with empty pockets and the question, did we freeze for a word? A Boston docker counts the days the cranes finally turns again. A printer measures freedom by how often she must reuse the same lead E. A Pennsylvania farmer prays harder for the price of flour than for a speech. By the decade's end, parchment arrives with a long title and a short point. The North American Dominion Settlement, under the crown, but with its own legislature and courts and customs set locally within imperial rules. Not the separation you know, something polished enough to pass as peace. Be honest, how would you vote? For a word that smells like glory and hunger? Or for a word that smells like compromise and bread? The 1990s. Europe shakes like a bridge in a gale. Revolution, wars, and naval reports that arrive once late. The Dominion profits from a neutrality it can't always hold. The Royal Navy wants timber, sailcloth, flour. In return, London extends credit and cheaper insurance. Impressment angers the wharves. Free black sailors seek work and find suspicion on both sides. Loyalists drift back carefully, as if learning a new tide. Canals and turnpikes, once nice ideas, become arteries. Grain from the interior nudges east. Paper from city presses nudges opinions. At the waterfront, arguments about France get hot and circular. Liberty, equality, fraternity? Liberty without bread is just another word for hunger. In iron sheds, men hammer parts from machines that will change time and work. If you were a merchant, watching premiums fall under the crown's protection, even as the price of conscience rises, would you sell the second to buy more of the first? The 1800s. The West smells like pine, fir, and promises. Instead of one huge transaction, the middle of the continent becomes a lattice of treaties, servitudes, and custom exemptions. You could get lost inside. French influence in the hotline lingers longer. British administrators love nap lines. Life does not. Dominion leaders count the distance between our right and their calm as they write London. On the trails, interpreters from native nations bargain for land, whiskey, iron, schools, for winter survival, not romantic abstractions. Garrison soldiers live long winters under gray skies, eating salted pork and drilling to numbness. Many serve less an idea than a role that keeps a rough world from breaking in. If your house stood at the map's edge and on the far side lived people you traded fish with as a child, would you call this order peace? The 18 Tings. Imperial wars refuse to stay overseas. The Dominion feeds fleets and wants better credit and privileges in return. Taxes and naval impressment reach tavern debates. Should boys from New England drown for a minister's mistake on the Thames? Roads filled with veterans who can't find work. They carry silence and the habits of muskets, night watch, drill, and the face of a friend who did not come home. A new voice rises, merchant manufacturers who want tariff autonomy so they don't suffocate between London and Le Havre. Inside kitchens and counting houses, a question scratches like a mouse in the wall. If they need us strong, why do we keep asking for permission? Doesn't talk of freedom always return when talk turns to taxes and credit? The 1920s. Canals and roads stitched towns into a market, the way a seam stitches cloth. Market pulls newspapers, newspapers pull arguments. Clubs debate property and labor, schools and assembly rights. From Boston to Quebec, Philadelphia to Halifax, mills and shipyards multiply. Yesterday's craftsmen become factory hands with a clock on the wall. Politics runs into an older and deeper wound, slavery. The British world leans toward abolition. In the Dominion, Southern plantations survive through exceptions that sting. Assembly halls echo with hard phrases about property. Churches answer with harder phrases about souls. On the docks, free black sailors navigate laws that shift from pier to pier. On rice fields, families whisper about news from London that hasn't arrived. If you were a planter with British bank loans, how much would each day of delay cost? If you were an enslaved woman, hearing that somewhere someone promises soon, would that word carry you to autumn? The 1930s. The empire steps where the ground shakes. Abolition across British holdings. The Dominion screams, argues, bargains, and finally signs what newspapers call the Charleston Settlement. Gradual emancipation with compensation bonds, schooling in exchange for labor contracts, courts in exchange for time. No one leaves unscarred. Planters rage and count losses. Free people cheer and count steps. How many to a piece of land where you can bury a seed? In port cities, a new class appears. Small entrepreneurs, sailors, tradespeople juggling 2 jobs and 3 hopes. Orders to southern garrisons: change, talk first, shoot last. It doesn't always work, but for the first time in years, some harbors breathe without chains around the pilings. Tell me, can justice be bought with bonds? And if so, who redeems them? The past or the future?
Rails punch space. The telegraph shrinks time. Hundreds of thousands arrive from Europe. Hunger, wars, and dreamers. Irish crowd the docks. Germans fill shops and farms. Swedes drift toward the forests. Cities grow like shade trees, and in the shade it's darker. Tenements, disease, child labor, night lines for water. Papers sharpen, bolder headlines, crueler cartoons. Strikes pop and fade. On rice and cotton coasts, post-emancipation life invents itself. Leases, contracts, tiny co-ops. Some fair, some just a new name for old chains. On distant high plains, borders get settled by pen 1 month and by rifle butt the next. 3-sided commissions, Dominion, Empire, neighbors, try to stamp into maps what hasn't set in soil. Would you call this thunder progress if your son stood 12 hours at a loom? The 1850s. Coal brings heat, steam brings tempo. The Dominion grows richer unevenly. Northern ports industrialize faster than the southern fields find their new footing after emancipation. A hard politics arrives. Customs nationalism. We need our own market rules to be treated as equals in the empire. London mutters about common interest and, more often than not, listens rather than orders. When your subject feeds your fleet with grain and timber, you choose your verbs with care. Unions appear along the docks. Debates about the working day and accident insurance rattle the assembly. Officers talk about rails west and new forts north. In the barracks, men trade jokes about pay that chases prices and never catches them. In families who were enslaved, a first literate generation learns to write. In their copybooks, a simple sentence lands with heavy weight. My mother is no one's property. When you hear that sentence, doesn't history have to change itself? The 1860s. Telegraph wires pin the map. News run faster than trains. Rumor runs faster than truth. In Europe, new deals and old jealousies. On the eastern seaboard, the Dominion toasts half a century of peace under the flag, then plans a centennial of the old declaration, read here not as a divorce, but as a declaration of rights under a crown. Empires love velvet words and iron habits. Dominion politicians say responsible government, our own foreign policy, monetary autonomy. Their opponents point to lower borrowing costs and ask, why leave what works? In working districts, a blunter anger boils. Housing, water, wages. There, the hunger is not for symbols, but for bread. Frontier soldiers live one more war of short blood and long winters. Patrols, sometimes skirmishes, more often negotiations that smell of tobacco and coffee. Young officers born after the 1780s reconciliation read books about glory and miss the receipts underneath. Glory is bought with someone's bread and someone's skin. Between town and farm, north and south, new capital and old clout, a quiet rope tightens. Some call it mature stability. Some call it the breath before a storm. Now, listen for the wire's faint tick. July 1869. A cable from Europe to the New World. The empire, tired by wars and credit, offers the Dominion a new arrangement. Separate commercial treaties, yes. Domestic control over public borrowing, yes. A coastal defense fleet, yes. And for the first time, the word that turns rooms hot, the right to a referendum in 1876, 100 years to the day after the Declaration, that rang like a bell, but in our line did not rip the cord. Different hands received the same message. In Boston, the printer who once measured freedom by a single lead E lifts the damp sheet from the press and smiles the way people smile when they've known poverty and remember its taste. On the southern coast, a man whose mother was born enslaved and who was born free sits on his stoop and counts whether a shop is possible if tariffs ease. In Halifax, a dock worker who has aged alongside a crane asks his foreman, "So what do they promise us now?" In the assembly, a young orator who's never seen war talks about dignity as if he could hold it in his palm. In a barracks, a private mouths the word referendum and feels a small fear in his chest. Who am I without orders? Now to you. If 1876 puts ballots in boxes, how would you vote? For a clean break? For a commonwealth under the crown? For another long compromise that sands down edges and delays the final step another decade? If tariffs fall, does your vote change? If credit cheapens, does your vote change? If workers say they don't care about flags so long as there's bread and clean water, does your vote change? If a neighbor who lost a son in a border skirmish says the boy died for a word, does your vote change? Our chronicle has walked the 1770s through the 1860s, 5 decades of hope, 5 decades of arithmetic. We've seen mothers keep bees because sugar is dear, soldiers sleep 3 to a blanket, planters learn to lose their power. Free families learn not to fear daylight. Workers forge a new strength. Politicians discover how to whisper louder than they once shouted. We haven't decided who is right. A chronicle doesn't judge. It asks. So let me end tonight with the question that opens the next series. If in 1876, the Dominion truly goes to the polls, not with a musket in hand, but with a ballot, can a nation held together by credit and compromise be born with a yes or no? Or has it already been born in the long water lines, the tin cups in barracks, the first school copybooks of children who weren't allowed letters a generation ago? Between telegraph sparks and the yellow light of assembly lamps, a country not yet printed on any official map pauses. It takes one breath in, one breath out. To be continued. Next time, the 1870s and 1880s. First parties, first nationwide strikes, first secret bargains with neighbors, first ballots in boxes. And I'll start with this. If freedom arrives not by cannon, but by receipt, does it taste the same?
If the crown won, what happens next? Subscribe to Counterline and turn on the bell so you don't miss part 2.